This is the sarcophagus of Hennefer I. Inside is, as you might expect, Tim. No, obviously it's Hennefer I. Her origins, unlike many pharaohs, were relatively humble. Not born into royalty, but instead ascended to the throne after a bunch of weird nerds picked her out of a freezer of an Asian grocery store. And, as you may have seen, she was then carefully mummified with all of the proper oils, ointments, unguents, and enchantments fitting the most high-born of Pharaoh, to be ferried down the Duat into the afterlife. Frankly, Anubis was probably extremely confused. She is likely the most accurate mummy made in thousands of years, because we had to consult brand new mass spec data from archaeological finds and translate the wall of an ancient temple or two just to make all of the stuff we needed for the process. It was quite the experiment, and objectively, tasted awful.
Oh, my breath smells of mummy.
If you missed it, there's also a companion video over on Nebula where we took a deep dive into the hieroglyphs and recipes that we used to make Hennefer and decorate the sarcophagus. But we'll talk more about Nebula in a bit. As an added bonus, we had these instructions for how to make a mummy printed on actual Egyptian papyrus, and they're available in our store if you want one. Link below. But no pharaoh's burial would be complete without a proper tomb. And while she is lovingly displayed in our office, this cabinet is no pyramid. So, how do you build a pyramid? The same way that you eat an elephant, with a big ramp and help from some friends. All around the world, humans figured out that if you make a really big pile of rocks, it tends to stick around, and it looks very impressive for millennia, especially if you decorate it and make sure the rocks fit together really nicely. The resulting megastructures could in turn be used for any number of religious, ceremonial, or bureaucratic reasons. Maybe you put your dead in or under them, or your rulers lived at the top. Or slap a temple on top and maybe the gods will be more willing to accept your sacrifices and grant your prayers. No matter the case, there is an untold number of massive stone structures made by a variety of ancient cultures all over the world. Much like termites, get enough humans in an area and we start building really tall things, and making holes in all of your shit. The ancient Egyptians love hogging the spotlight, but the works of the Mesoamericans, and even just other cultures in Africa and Eurasia, built enormous structures, ranging from pyramids to ziggurats to massive towers or palaces. For some context, the Egyptians are known as the pyramid builders, and they built approximately 140 total. The Mayans, on the other hand, built literally thousands, and we're still discovering more. These ancient megastructures are different than our modern ones in that they were built with no power tools or modern materials. No hydraulic pistons, no electricity, and definitely no internal combustion engines to power machines. Instead, they had to rely on simple mechanical principles, some very clever hand tools, rock, plaster, and concrete. Oh, and wood, of course, but wood doesn't preserve as well. But with the rise of TV, and more recently podcasts and TikTok, millions of people have become convinced that certain of these incredible feats of human ingenuity were actually the result of aliens. The Egyptians and Maya are both often subject to this nonsense, and you'll have the likes of Joe Rogan and others spreading just the dumbest nonsense. And TikTok is usually a fire hose of misinformation, save for a few very hardworking creators desperately trying to debunk it all. And, of course, this is often just thinly veneered racism, as the alien theory nonsense usually only seems to be brought up when the ancient peoples weren't considered white. Funny how almost no one claims that the Romans or Greeks were incapable of what they achieved, but live in a hotter climate and suddenly people start accusing you of being incapable of stacking rocks neatly. Today, we are going to explore some of the very real technologies that were used to build the pyramids of Giza, Teotihuacan, and many other ancient marvels, and see what it would take to build Hennefer a more fitting final home. Specifically, we're going to focus on the tools and technology that ancient peoples had for extracting and shaping stone, as well as the metals and materials used to make those tools. I think conceptually the hardest part for people to grasp is how any of this was possible without power tools or modern steel, and it's often the most misunderstood part of history. Eventually, we'll make a part 2 to this video where we explore how they moved and manipulated the large blocks once they were created, but we need both more space and, frankly, more stone to make that video properly, and probably a large collection of big burly blokes to help with the process. Though the short version of that upcoming video is basically this. Get enough humans together and there's nothing we can't move with ropes, pulleys, rollers, and the correct application of force. Though, if you want to help make that video happen, consider becoming a patron of the channel. If every subscriber donated even $1, it would be enough to let us make videos for many years to come. And our growing Discord community has become quite lively and fun, which patrons get to join. Of course, if you're already a patron, special thanks to you for supporting our work over the years. It really does make it easier to produce these super long videos. Anyway, our whole modern world really only exists because we as a species learned to master first iron and then steel. And now, every single product that you use likely has some amount of extremely high quality steel in it. This includes scissors and knives and other tooling, but also pistons, drive shafts, springs, gears, screws, bolts, or any number of shiny stainless product. But the pyramids weren't made out of steel and glass, they were made out of rock. Specifically, mostly limestone, and they got that rock from as close to the building site as possible to avoid transport problems. The quarry for the Great Pyramids of Giza, for example, is directly behind them, and when you've got decades to get a project done and tens of thousands of people to help you do it, there's very little humans can't achieve. Though that isn't to say that limestone was the only rock type used. Everything from marble or alabaster to hard granite and even jade could be worked into incredibly intricate forms. And ancient peoples all around the world used these stones to make artwork that is still breathtaking to this day. But how did they do it? Well, the nice thing with rock is that if you have a second rock that is as hard or harder than the first one, congratulations, you are capable of shaping that first rock. Just smash them together and you can break little bits off. And don't forget, rocks are also abrasive, so rubbing one against another can produce a very fine finish and give you even more fine control over the shape of the rock. There's a reason that we still use stones for sharpening our tools. Sure, we've added a motor, but a grinding wheel is still just a spinning rock. And I have a collection of special stones just for sharpening my cooking knives. This long one is literally ruby, and this other one is a chunk of jade. In Stone Age societies, diorite, a very hard kind of granite, was especially prized for making tools out of, as a hammer made from it would work very well for quarrying limestone and last a long time without breaking. And axes or adze will stay sharp for a long while allowing a thinner blade compared to other rock types. And of course, flint and obsidian were also highly prized for tool making. You also don't need large chunks of rock. Rather, by making them into an abrasive powder, you can use sticks or other tools to rub the powder and sand away material. Remember, it's not the paper that makes sandpaper work. The paper is just for convenience. Though we'll talk more about this in a moment, as it is way more important than it may initially sound. If, literally, your only job all day is to sit there whacking away at one stone with another or slowly sanding in the fine details, you can not only make a lot of progress, but will have remarkable control over the shape of the block that you carve. However, even during the construction of the Great Pyramids in around 2500 BCE, the Egyptians weren't limited to stone tools. Instead, the Bronze Age had begun hundreds of years earlier. But it wasn't just the Egyptians. Cultures all over the world were also well within the Bronze Age at that point. And before that, starting as early as 7500 BCE, many cultures had already learned to work with copper. So they'd been using metal for millennia already. Copper is actually one of a few metals that can be found in its pure elemental form in nature in reasonable quantity. It, along with gold, silver, and platinum group metals, can be found in what are called native deposits. So you don't even need to understand smelting ore to find and use it initially. People would either find some in a stream or sticking out of a bit of exposed ground, and end up digging out large chunks of metal. These could be directly shaped through repeated annealing of the metal and then bashing on it, and eventually people figured out that you could melt and cast it into even more intricate shapes. When we think of native cultures in the Americas, though, we're taught to think of them as purely Stone Age societies, but that's not accurate. Near the Great Lakes in what is now Canada and the US is the largest native copper deposit in the world. So for thousands of years, what was called the Old Copper Culture or the Old Copper Complex made tools and decorations out of copper almost exclusively. They also traded that copper all over the continent. They happened to exist in a really weird location that had huge amounts of native copper, but terrible quality stone, so making tools from copper was just the logical solution. Ironically, the abundance of native copper actually prevented them from learning how to smelt ore. They treated copper like a sort of weird rock, so never learned how to take that next step and convert it to bronze. As far as we can tell, in the north of North America, they never melted or cast the copper, and exclusively reshaped native copper chunks. But even then, the range of tools and pieces they made were astounding. And eventually, they set up trade networks spanning the continent to import better stone, and then trade that copper far and wide. However, down in South America, the Inca had figured out not only smelting copper, but also bronze. And since they had some of the richest gold and silver mines on Earth, they also made extensive use of precious metals. These ideas had begun to spread north, and smiths in West Mexico were smelting copper and even using lost wax casting techniques imported from South America. And by the time of the Spanish contact, even the Aztecs had developed some bronze metallurgy through the conquest of areas to the south and west that already had it. Truly, the Bronze Age was beginning properly on both continents, so had the timing of history worked out differently, the Americas would have looked very different at the moment of first contact. Closer to Egypt is one of the oldest known copper mines in the Timna Valley of what is now Israel, and it was in use since around 6000 BCE. However, this deposit didn't have nearly as much native copper, and most of the material was as various copper ores. The nice thing is that copper ores are actually really easy to spot if you know what you're looking for, so it's relatively easy to find an outcropping and then chase the vein. Copper ores are also relatively soft and therefore easy to mine. Unlike native copper though, you do then have to put in the effort to actually smelt the ore if you want metal. Thankfully, copper is an easy element to smelt and requires little more than a clay crucible and a campfire. Allow me to demonstrate. As we discussed in our recent iron video, setting fires inside a commercial building is generally a no-no. So we're going to be using an electric metal melter, which is actually going to be slower and more difficult than if we were doing this with a campfire. We picked up this beautiful piece of malachite, and rather than smash it, we also picked up some powdered stuff. Malachite is one of many copper minerals that have been mined over the years. Its chemical composition is just copper carbonate, so its processing is really easy. It's also ridiculously pretty, so of course a curious human is going to grab the weird green rock. Now, you do need to be careful when buying this, because our first batch turned out to be colored acrylic plastic that was sold as lab-made malachite, which is bullshit. It's horrible plastic that burns with stinking fumes to nothing but black ash. The real irony is that in a video about ancient copper, we literally got EA Nasir'd. And I'll be sure to make sure my review is just as scathing, though maybe not on clay. Our second attempt with actual malachite worked much better. You can see that the initial step of the carbonate cooking off blackens the powder as it forms copper oxide. But importantly, there are no horrible fumes this time. All that should be coming off is carbon dioxide. As this goes on, the powder reduces in size and begins to sinter or stick together a little. Once we deemed it was well cooked enough, we dumped it out into a tray. This way we could mix in a similar amount of charcoal powder and then get everything back onto the heat. The charcoal is going to burn and release carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. These can react with the copper and rip the oxygen off, leaving pure metal, while also preventing outside oxygen getting in and turning it all back into copper oxide. When everything had cooked, we poured out as much liquid metal as we could, and then dumped the rest into a bucket of water. This made it really easy to separate out the charcoal, which floats and leaves clean metal behind. It's mostly tiny beads, so all of this needed to get remelted together to be usable. As you can see, this is not rocket surgery. It's practically caveman easy bake. And humans are curious and would certainly notice if their campfire accidentally turned their weird green rock into shiny copper metal. Once this process was understood, it was only a matter of time before somebody figured out the upgrade. At some point, or rather a few times throughout history, some clever human figured out that if you melt copper and then add in a certain percentage of these weird-looking, unusually heavy black rocks, instead of the usual red-orange of copper, the metal will cool to a beautiful golden color, and the result was eventually called bronze. Those weird black rocks are called cassiterite and are the main ore of tin. To show you just how easy this is, let's make some bronze. I weighed out 500 grams of copper scrap that we've saved from various machining projects, and I also bought some high-purity tin ingots to stand in for cassiterite. This was my first time holding a sample of tin, and I was not prepared for just how heavy these little nuggets are. But that's what happens when you have an element that's an entire row lower on the periodic table. And the ore is just as weirdly heavy. Anyway, we got our metal melting furnace set up again, and then slowly fed in the copper. This took a few rounds of shoving it in, letting it melt, and then adding more. Once the full charge had been added and liquefied, we scooped off any slag and plopped in our tin nugget. We gave it a couple of minutes to dissolve, then gave it a quick mix and could pour it out directly into a preheated mold. After quenching some water to quickly cool it off, because we're wildly impatient, we were left with some stunningly beautiful golden bars. These ingots can either be cold worked or melt and cast into whatever shape you want. And the best part is that now that the alloy is made, its melting point is even lower, so an even colder fire can be used to work with it. Now, you can't quench harden bronze the way that you do with iron. Even if you try, the material doesn't harden. However, you can work harden many copper alloys, bronze included. This means that when you whack a bit of bronze, it literally stiffens, and if you do that to the edges, you can end up with a surface that stays sharp much longer. But during the Bronze Age, there was actually another kind of bronze that used a different mineral, and the resulting alloy cooled to a beautiful silver color. That mineral was one of several ores of arsenic. This gives what was called arsenical bronze, and while the process of making it was extremely toxic, the end result was a bronze that was even harder and stronger and perfect for toolmaking. While this may seem insane to a modern viewer that knows just how toxic arsenic is, in the past, humans used arsenic for all kinds of stuff. Some arsenic ores are very brightly colored and come in shades of red, yellow, and orange. The red-orange one was called realgar, and the more yellow one was orpiment. And at least some viewers that watch the Apothecary Diaries just had their ears perk up. In the past, arsenic ore was used for paint, wallpaper, and makeup, and even today there is still a custom of adding some to wine in China for certain festivals. It also used to be sprinkled around the house to repel animals or insects, which is a very classic human thing. Take poison, spread it everywhere, and then make a surprised Pikachu face when it inevitably makes you sick.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
But the point is that arsenical bronze was actually usually discovered first, because people already had a reason to collect arsenic. And more than that, arsenic ores tend to co-occur with copper ores, and some copper ores are literally just a 50-50 mix of arsenic and copper. So much so that even modern copper smelters have to have significant systems in place to capture and remove all of that arsenic rather than release it into the environment. The thing is, humans aren't stupid. They realized that the process was dangerous, but arsenical bronze had some very real advantages. For only a comparatively small amount of arsenic, you get a very strong alloy. You need far more tin by weight to achieve the same strength. So 2% arsenic was as good as 7 or 8% tin. And arsenic is relatively common, making it much easier to get in the sort of bulk that you need for smelting. However, once larger tin deposits were found and bronze with closer to 10 or 15% became reasonable to produce, arsenic was largely phased out. There is an old myth of the lame smith, as in a smith that can't walk. Hephaestus, the Greek smith god, for example, is usually portrayed as unable to walk properly. A huge part of this myth is because of arsenical bronze. When you spend years working with it, the poison seeps into you and slowly destroys your body, leaving you unable to walk and eventually gives you cancer or worse. Since I value being able to walk, and especially because I like my blood as about as cancer-free as is reasonably possible, we're not going to make arsenical bronze. But know that it is comparable to the very high tin bronze that we've made. For the rest of our tools, it's time to do some casting. We took some of our homemade bronze, as well as more copper, and cast a pair of chisels to test out on rocks in a moment. The bronze one does need to be tempered though to avoid it being brittle, by bringing it up just to the point that it starts to darken. If you go to a red heat, it's too hot and then becomes brittle. Then the working edge of both chisels could be hammered to work harden them. These are now ready for use. One last note is that bronze is also very weather resistant. Copper alloys in general are pretty weather resistant, but bronze is a step above. This is why we tend to make statues and boat parts out of it. It's also why we find bronze artifacts mostly intact, whereas iron items, like armor or swords, tend to rust away to nothing if not carefully cared for. By far my favorite example of this is the Antikythera mechanism. It's the oldest known mechanical computer, made of dozens of tiny, intricate parts and gears, and it was found at the bottom of the ocean in a shipwreck. It had sat in the ocean for more than 2,000 years, yet remained partly intact. Sure, it's not in the best condition, but that's more than I can say for literally any piece of iron left in the same circumstances. Even in its ruined state, enough detail was preserved that working replicas of the mechanism have been made. And over on the amazing channel ClickSpring, he's making as close to a perfect copy as possible, using only the tools that would have been available at the time. And I have spent many hours watching every second of those videos twice. Cannot recommend them enough. Moving on. Truly, the only reason that bronze was phased out is that it's much more expensive than iron, because both copper and tin are relatively rare on Earth, whereas iron can be found basically everywhere in huge quantity. To put some numbers to it, in Earth's crust, copper exists at about 50 parts per million, tin at about 2 parts per million, whereas iron comes in at a nice round 50,000. And this is why we eventually switched to iron. Anyway, now that we have some tools to work with, let's move on to cutting some rocks. As I said, the simplest way to do this is by just bashing 2 rocks together. But with arsenical or tin bronze, it was easy enough to make chisels, axes, adze, and more for precise cutting. Not to mention saws for cutting soft things like wood. We picked up a variety of the sorts of rock types that were used by the ancients to see what it would take to work with each. The softest is alabaster, which is a magnesium-based mineral, and is soft enough that you can scratch it with your fingernail if you push hard enough. Unsurprisingly, both the copper and bronze chisels cut it very easily, and we even fashioned a simple D-bit out of brass and were able to drill right through it. So you can understand why even modern sculptors like this stuff. It's incredibly easy to shape, and it was valued highly by the ancients for making all kinds of complex objects. Moving up in difficulty, we have limestone. This is a sedimentary form of calcium carbonate and is usually thousands of incredibly thin layers of sediment that have been squished together with time and pressure. Even copper was able to bite into this, and our copper chisel was plenty capable of shaping it, albeit slowly. Bronze, though, fared much better and cut it with ease, almost as well as a modern steel chisel. Now we start to get into the really hard stuff: marble and travertine. These are both metamorphic rocks, where limestone was dissolved and then reformed into a denser form elsewhere. The white marble is a little bit harder than the travertine and also has far fewer voids. At this point, the copper chisel starts to have some real trouble. It starts to deform and leave metallic streaks behind rather than really cutting. Bronze fared much better. Marble, it was capable of doing some damage, but the lack of voids meant that it was harder to get a good grip and bite into the rock. Comparing this to modern steel, which cuts marble with ease, does show the limits of bronze. Finally, we have granite. This stuff is so hard that the copper and bronze chisels left bright streaks of metal, and the rock was otherwise unaffected.
Now, if you ever hit me and I find out about it...
Even a modern steel chisel couldn't really do much and was leaving metal behind. But don't forget rule number 1. You only need a harder rock. Granite is mainly quartz, which means it's got a hardness of 6 or 7 on the Mohs scale, so we need something harder. Diamond, of course, would work, but a far cheaper and more abundant option is ruby, or rather corundum, which is the low-grade version and far less pretty, but just as hard. Corundum is just aluminum oxide, so it's relatively abundant on Earth, and it's the main thing that we use as a grinding abrasive even today. So this chunk of ruby I have absolutely cuts the granite without much fuss, and we'll see just how amazing powdered corundum is in just a moment. Now, assuming that you didn't just find a chunk of conveniently sized rock laying around, you're going to need to quarry it. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this means that you need to cut blocks of stone out of the ground, but In reality, quarrying involves very little cutting and actually much more cracking. Unlike metal, rocks are highly granular and brittle, and many have distinct directions that they'll preferentially break in, sort of like how wood has grain. It's easy to split wood along the grain, but difficult in other directions. Similarly, it's easy to split rock along the so-called grain boundaries, and even massive boulders can be neatly split apart using only a few wedges and strategically placed holes. The wedges are driven into the holes to apply pressure along the whole length of the rock, and are tapped in bit by bit until the whole rock suddenly breaks. These days, that means metal wedges, but historically that wasn't even necessary. The Egyptians were known to use wooden wedges, and then make them expand by adding boiling water rather than just smacking them, though copper or bronze wedges would work just as well as any steel wedge. No matter the case, not only does this break the rock into more manageable chunks, it often leaves a relatively flat surface, or at least one that doesn't require much more work to make it flat. And we'll come back to how the Egyptians and others managed to produce incredibly flat surfaces we find in just a moment. Before that, how do you actually drill those initial holes to put the wedge in? Well, the simplest method is with a chisel. Bash away at the rock with a hard pointy thing and you can eventually make a usable hole. This is very similar to how a modern rock drill works. It's more punching the rock than cutting it per se, but without modern power tools, these holes are rather rough and are never perfectly circular, and getting a lot of depth or concentricity is really hard. But the ancients had a much more clever and precise way to make holes. All throughout Egyptian architecture and decoration, we see a huge amount of extremely round, deep holes. Ones that are clearly drilled out rather than carved with a chisel. The conspiracy nutters like to point to these as evidence of aliens or lasers or nonsense, but the reality is both cooler and very simple. Not only did the Egyptians literally leave us pictures depicting how they drilled holes, we also have a large number of unfinished holes that show snapshots of what the process looked like. To get started, you need a round tube. This could absolutely be made out of wood or bone, but most often was either copper or bronze because they're going to wear down more slowly. This was attached to a bit of wood that was sometimes carved to have a handle that was offset from the shaft. This allows the user to crank the stick and make it behave like a drill. Though there are also many depictions of bow drills being used, and there were very likely pump drills used as well, depending on the size of the hole that you're cutting. Different practitioners almost certainly would have had different preferences for how they provided power to their drills. But at the end of the day, you make the round thing go spinny spin. Again, this is not rocket science. For our tests, we whipped up a quick pump drill, and I made the end have a slot to allow me to easily change out bits for different sized holes. For example, here's a very fine D bit made out of brass. Within maybe about 30 or 40 seconds, I can easily and quickly cut through a piece of wood. And for soft stone, the results are great as well. It's perfect for making beads or making the eyes on a sculpture. But wood or bone or even bronze won't cut hard rock on its own, nor was that the intention. Instead, to complete the drill, a slurry of hard grit, either silica sand or ideally corundum, mixed with either oil or water was put between the rock surface and the drill head. The drill head is made to stay in place using some sort of guide until the hole is established enough to self-guide. Here we're using a board with a hole drilled out, but a few bits of bamboo or other sticks would have worked just as well. The slurry needs to be topped up regularly, and you can actually hear when the slurry is depleted, so it's really easy to know when to add more. All we do now is crank away like a horny teen that found Grandpa's special milk crate of magazines in the garage. Is this a lot of effort? Yes, absolutely yes. Does it drill quickly? I mean, it's slower than a modern drill, but if you're not in a rush, within a pretty short time you can make a lot of progress. And by varying the diameter of the tube you use, you can control the size of the hole you drill very carefully. As this cuts, rather than an empty hole like you might expect from a modern twist drill bit, you're left with a deep ring carved into the stone and a central core that remains. This core would be broken by inserting a wedge into the ring to make the core snap out. And with this being the main way that they drilled holes, sure enough we find discarded cores like this all over Egypt. Because of the nature of this tool, it tends to wobble a lot more at the start of the cut, but becomes more concentric as you work. So holes always had a very slight taper to them and were a bit wider at the top than the bottom. We tested this on all of our different rock types, and were honestly pretty amazed at how well this worked. Limestone, being the softest, cut the fastest, and half an hour of drilling got us about 3/4 of an inch into the rock. Travertine is a bit harder, so it was a bit slower, but not by much. By the time we got to proper marble, it did take a solid 45 minutes of drilling to cut through a half-inch slab. And finally, the granite was brutal. 20 minutes of drilling barely got a few millimeters deep. Enough that the cut was started, but it was noticeably slower. For all of these tests, we experimented with different drill types, and while a bow drill works perfectly fine, it is brutally exhausting compared to the pump drill. The pump drill was so smooth and easy that a single person could comfortably drill for extended periods of 20 or more minutes. Also, all of this made it very clear that this must have been a group activity in the past. I don't care how buff you are, powering a bow drill for long enough to dig into granite is not a single person task. You will get tired very quickly and are going to need to be changed out. But if you've got a few people sitting together and working, they'd likely be talking or singing to keep the rhythm and prevent it from being boring. After all, this literally was their profession, and they likely had apprentices and helpers to make sure that they could get the job done on time. Regardless of how you applied power, our copper drill bit made beautiful cores out of each of the rock types that look exactly like the ones we find in Egypt and elsewhere. And even our nice copper bit does wear out remarkably quickly. We had taken to cutting a few grooves into the face of the bit to help the grit get into the cut, and we had to recut them every 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes depending on the rock type. If you were using wood or bone instead of metal, you're going to have to keep stock replacement bits on hand ready for how quickly they're going to wear out. Speaking of which, just to demonstrate that you don't even need metal, we picked up a turkey leg from the grocery store and quickly cleaned and shaped the bone to be a drill bit. Then, just as before, we used our grit slurry and this time cut into the travertine. Sure enough, it cuts almost as fast as the copper and leaves a nice circular hole, even though the bone isn't perfectly round. This technique is so effective that it's still basically the same way that we cut glass, rock, and ceramic today. Only these days, we often use diamond-tipped bits and just keep the cutting head wet instead of having to deal with a separate cutting slurry. But the principle is exactly the same. If you're cutting hard materials like rock, this is just the best way to do it. And we know that this is how they did it for two reasons. First, at the bottom of the unfinished holes, we usually find residue of two things: copper and either corundum or quartz. And secondly, again, they left us pictures. Like, a lot of pictures. The Egyptians were some of the most aggressive documentarians in history, and recently we even identified some of the drill bits in museum collections. Though if you want a bit of ancient Egyptian documentation for yourself, don't forget to get your mummy assembly instructions after the video. Now, don't think that this technique is limited to round holes. The exact same idea can also be applied to slicing stones. If instead of a tube you use a sheet of copper or bronze, or even a slice of wood, and work it back and forth, you now have a saw that will cut even the hardest rocks. The Chinese are known to use a version of this technique, and they didn't even bother with metal at all. For cutting jade, which is one of the hardest rocks, they managed with only a bow and some string, and of course grit and slurry. We tested it, and to our shock, it does actually work. We cut into marble using just a tree branch and some string, and while yes, the string did break a lot and need constant replacement, and yes, it was slow, it did cut the marble, though the copper saw, of course, worked way better. But a string would be better for really deep cuts, as the cost of a long copper saw is much higher. With a copper saw, we were able to score marble in maybe 5 minutes, and then a light tap with a hammer and we now have two nice pieces. Remember, the abrasives often only need to be used to give you a breaking point. When we sliced into the side of the marble, we didn't need to go very deep before we could use a bronze chisel to give it a little whack and break off a nice chunk. And of course, once you've got your slabs or pieces cut to size, you can go at them with chisels and drills or even small abrasive stones to work them into shape. And especially don't forget little pokey tools and sticks, as well as more grinding slurry to work in the fine details. Sure, it's not going to be fast, but remember, there was no TikTok in the past. People literally had nothing better to do all day. So an extremely manual task is a great way to spend your time, especially with a group of friends, and the results are just as good as what could be achieved with modern tools, if a bit slower. Okay, we've drilled holes and we've cut slabs, but there's one last thing we need to address. One of the things you hear a lot is that the various blocks are stacked together and are so flat that you can't even fit a credit card between them. This is usually in reference to either the Egyptians or the Mesoamericans, and again is for some reason used to indicate lasers or other nonsense. Just quickly before we flatten some stones though, I want to mention that the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of the Mesoamericans, while similar looking on the outside, are actually very different internally. Mesoamerican pyramids use rubble as an internal fill, with cut stones on the outside. Those stones are then often covered in plaster to allow for painting or further decoration. Also, Mesoamerican pyramids often are more like nesting dolls, in that they went through many cycles of renovation. Rulers would periodically commission the building of a bigger pyramid on top of existing ones, so really it's pyramids all the way down. And their pyramids almost always had a temple or palace on the top. If they wanted to bury a dead king in a pyramid, they had to dig into it and build a tomb as needed. In the old world, things are a bit different. Some of the pyramids are solid carved blocks of rock all the way through, though they reserved the most nicely carved stuff for the outside, and internal blocks were a little more rough. Others used mud brick or rubble for a filling. It really depended on the location, resource availability, and what you intended to do with the pyramid or structure. In Egypt, pyramids were exclusively tombs, so they had a pointy top, sometimes covered in gold, and the outside would be polished, beautiful limestone. But the Egyptians, and of course the rest of the ancient peoples, built more than pyramids. Ziggurats, temples, and palaces galore, all over the ancient world, and they all relied on the same basic building techniques. So, how did they make the perfectly fitting rocks that went on the outside of the structures? And how did they achieve those super flat surfaces that we find all over the place? In order to understand how these were made, we need to understand how you make something flat in the first place. These days, we are awash with perfectly flat objects. You can buy a hunk of granite off Amazon that is flat to within a micron or two, and with one of these as a reference, it's very easy to copy that flatness to another object. But what happens when you're the first person to want a flat thing, and Amazon is still just a rainforest, not a blood-sucking corporation? Well, it turns out that making that initial flat surface is actually really easy. Well, okay, not easy, but not complicated either. It's just a lot of work. It's called the three-plate method. To do this, you need to start with three objects that are already as flat as you can reasonably make them by eye. For the sake of demonstration, we're going to use three rocks that we made out of plaster. This way, they're really soft, so the process goes quickly. But normally, you'd choose a hard rock or metal for this. To start, you put some of your grinding medium on rock A, and then you take rock B and start grinding the two together. This process is helped by using a marking die, because you can grind the two pieces together and then directly see where they're rubbing together, and thus which areas still need to be ground down. Today we'd use something like blue dicum, but the ancient Egyptians used red ochre for marking out their build lines. This is a natural clay-based pigment that humans have used for paint for longer than we have history books, and it worked amazingly well for doing this process. Anyway, when rocks A and B are relatively flush, you move on to grinding together stones B and C, again going until the two are flush. Then you move on to C and A. This cycle goes around and around and around, and each time the rocks get a bit flatter. By cycling through the stones, you're essentially averaging out the error between each. Eventually, the error across all three stones drops to basically zero. And ta-da, you now have a machinist-grade surface plate starting with literally no tools. On ours, two of the stones got perfectly flat, while the third had an ugly little divot left in it, but it would have been removed if we kept grinding. But again, this is just for demonstration, so it's fine. Of course, you don't need to start with 3 raw stones. Just like buying a modern surface plate, you could already have a flat stone or two, or maybe a metal plate prepared in advance, that you simply bring to the worksite. You then conduct the grinding process until the workpiece is as flat as you want it. If your goal is not a mere flat sarcophagus lid, but instead one of the blocks that are going to be on the outside of a structure, you don't even need to get that fancy. Simply grinding the rocks together until they fit perfectly is sufficient. Then you just bring them to the build site and stack them in the correct order to recreate that perfect prepared fit. Or get it as close as possible in advance and then do the final grinding in situ. Though this wasn't always the solution. In South America, the Inca were famous for polygonal bonded masonry, where the stones are made to fit together seemingly perfectly, while also being absolutely crazy shapes. While the Inca may have used lapping techniques, we actually have accounts for how they did this using only hammer stones. There are a few tricks though. First, much like in theater, an object only needs to look nice on the sides that you're gonna see. So the faces and front edges of the stone may look perfect, but internally the fit was much worse, and often left large voids for dirt or gravel to be used to fill in the spaces. It's much easier to get a block to look nice on one side than it would be for the blocks to be perfect through and through, even if a hammer stone is all you're using. But importantly, accounts mention that, quote, the fit had to be checked many times, which means that even large stones would be put in place, checked, then extracted to be worked further over and over again until it was perfect, which sounds like a lot of work and very heavy, and it absolutely was. But it's also very effective. Much like the Egyptians, the Inca had a workforce of tens of thousands of laborers, and a system that made sure they were fed so that they could keep working. And while many examples of massive stones are to be found, most of the rocks were selected to be much smaller and therefore a more manageable size, to make the process much easier. And they kept track of all of this work through this incredible writing system based on intricately woven knots called quipus, but that's a topic for another video. I realize this is kind of an underwhelming answer to how you achieve such a perfect fit, but the simplest solution is often the best one. You don't need lasers, just the right grit, a hammerstone, and a whole bunch of elbow grease. And, of course, a huge amount of manual labor. Remember, they're not ordering pre-made blocks from a factory across the world. They were making each and every block by hand and made to fit the next ones. And by using simple mechanical systems like levers, pulleys, and rollers, as well as a lot of human labor, they could manipulate the blocks as needed. As Archimedes once said, "Give me a place to stand, and with a lever I will move the whole world." We'll come back to the mechanical tricks that were used for transporting and stacking large stones in a future video, but we'll need to find a place to put our pyramid first, and more importantly, source the rock. Before you go, we want to know how long it really would take to drill through the granite, and we want a perfect core for our collection. So in a few days after this video goes out, I'm going to put the date on screen, we're going to be doing a live stream where we're going to drill holes and answer your questions. But here's the catch. Drilling is hard work, and the internet loves to watch people suffer. So, we will keep drilling for as long as people keep donating. So potentially, you could keep us drilling for hours upon hours. It's going to be a fun time, so be sure to stop by. In the meantime, if you missed it, you should absolutely watch our video on how we prepared Hennefer for her final resting place, as it is still probably the most expensive and complex video that we've done and took many months of work. And probably the best place to watch that video is actually over on Nebula, so you can see the bonus video that goes with it. Not only will you get to see us prepare Hennefer for her extracorporeal river cruise, but you'll learn all the spells inscribed on her sarcophagus to guide her along the way, and all the different rare and exotic ingredients that were used for the process. It's nearly 2 more hours of ancient Egyptian content from us, and because it's on Nebula, it's completely ad-free. And even this video has already been on Nebula for days because videos are always posted there first. Though that's really only scratching the surface of how cool Nebula is. If you haven't heard of it before, Nebula is the amazing creator-owned streaming platform where you can see ours and many of your favorite creators' videos. But it's not just the normal videos you see here on YouTube. Especially lately, Nebula, along with our fellow creators, have been working hard to make more prestige content that lives exclusively there. Shows like Becky Stern's Made in Shenzhen, where she takes you to the heart of the world's tech manufacturing to see how your devices and gizmos are really made. Or if you're looking for more nature and less tech, try Beyond the Backyard to see some of the world's most legendary animals in their native habitats. There's so much thoughtful, fascinating content to be found, so you'll have fun exploring once you sign up. Speaking of which, if you use my link to sign up, you get 50% off the annual plan, and it works out to about $30, which is only about $2.50 a month. So go to nebula.tv/thethoughtemporium and sign up today. Just click the link below or scan the QR code to get started, and I hope to see you over there. That's all for now, and we'll see you next time.